Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens, Black Table Talk. I'm your host, Mr. Sellers, and I have a special guest with us in the actual podcast room today. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Michael Johnson. I'm a senior policy analyst at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute.
Yes, and I want to say thank you for coming out today and being on our podcast. Today, we're going to be doing a podcast specifically about advocacy work around these efforts around returning citizens and focusing in on your unique experience over at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute and how you contribute to investing in the well-being of our fellow brothers and sisters who are coming home post-release from the legal system. So let's kick it off. My first question, I just want you to briefly talk about your current role in connection to advocacy for returning citizens and why this is a topic that is important to you.
So I joined DC Fiscal Policy Institute in 2021. And so really during that time, that was just after that was just after the murder of George Floyd. And so there was a lot of conversations going around about, policing and crime. But during my time, I really had a particular interest in and wanting to, support the populations of people who are returning home from incarceration. DC has really had one of the most restrictive laws in terms of allowing people to get their records cleared. And in 2022, the council introduced the Second Chance Amendment Act, which provided a comprehensive pathway for individuals with criminal records to get their records sealed or expunged. And so, this is, particularly, I think important because we know that returning citizens face so many barriers when it comes to reintegrating into society, whether that be for housing, employment, education. There's so many barriers. And so having a way for folks to have their records cleared in a timely manner is really critical, not only for, folks to be able to access some of those employment opportunities, but also things like housing. And so it's a start to be able to help people, really integrate back into society.
Awesome. So if you guys who are listening out there have not realized, today we're going to be looking at reentry from a policy called the Second Chance Amendment Act here in DC, which will impact our justice impacted brothers and sisters. Anyone who's been involved in the legal system has a record. And the policy itself, as Michael has shared, is all about record sealing and expungement. So we're going to continue on, but thank you for also mentioning, our fallen hero, George Floyd, and connecting that to your advocacy and why this is such an important thing. I'm going to now continue our conversation, given all that you shared, right? And explaining how, whether it's housing, educational, whether it's actually employment, and how it impacts us as returning citizens, it can be very inspiring. And the question is, what has inspired you to get involved in the work that you do here at DC Fiscal Policy Institute, right? I know you're going to probably mention some of the things that you're working on, but how did you, walk through that door your first day when you got the opportunity to work there?
Yeah. So, this area, really wasn't a big focus in my organization, when I first joined. And so, as a fiscal policy organization, we're very centered around advocating around the budget. And we do that because we understand that, where we put our resources is a reflection of where we put our values. And so, you know, I think during, particularly that time when we had a lot of conversations, a lot of the national narrative and in DC was around crime and policing. How do we invest more resources in police? How do we invest more resources to punish people? At the same time, we often, and I think not just at that time, but throughout the entire history of our country, have overlooked really the needs and supports for returning citizens. And so, our budget is probably one of the most clearest examples of this. As I said, I joined in 2021. Since 2022, just looking at the budget for returning citizens, that's actually gone down by over 26%. And so we are seeing a clear divestment, a clear reduction in our funding, and ultimately a reduction in how we value our returning citizens. And when we look at per person, that's even more alarming because the funding per person per returning citizens that's been dedicated has actually gone down by over 80% since 2022. So we're seeing a clear pattern of divestment and reduction of supports for returning citizens.
I'm so glad you put that into perspective, right? For those who are listening, it's so important that we have a space for returning citizens when it comes to budgets and fiscal policies and things like that, and getting that narrative and having you here, Mr. Johnson, being the senior policy analyst for the organization is very enlightening. And I want to just say that it seems like the math that just isn't mathing, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't help if we are defunding initiatives and policies around reentry, and to have it in the way that you all present it over at your organization is very helpful, and it can be a call to action from that perspective, especially when you talk about the percentages, right? You said it's alarming how basically reentry funding per person has declined over 80% since 2022. So it kind of highlights that the work that needs to still continue, right?
Yeah. And one other thing I'll say to that is, that is such a huge drop. When we think about in 2022, over $14,000 per person was allocated for returning citizens. Now, in 2025, that's just over $2,000 per person. And so when we think about all the supports that are needed, housing supports, mental health services, case managers, and all the different needs, that number is so small in comparison to the need. And what we saw, particularly from 2022 till now, is that DC, like many other places, receives an influx of federal dollars to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the place that we're in now is those federal dollars have run out. And so a lot of those federal dollars went to supporting not just programs supporting returning citizens, other programs throughout DC. But now that funding is run out. And so we have to really truly invest in our returning citizens, because between that time we also saw not only was funding declining, but the need we saw was increasing. We had over 700 people, 700 returning citizens access services in 2022 and 2023. But in 2024, we saw over 7,000 people access those services. So there's a clear need for those services. And if we're reducing our funding, reducing our resources, but increasing the need, that's not going to work out, and it's not sustainable.
I am you know, you've said so much, and it's heartbreaking because everything that you said is absolutely true. Even from what you're talking about now, we sat in a city council meeting, and it was a packed house with members of our organization sharing their lived experience about the lack of services and resources, particularly around substance use. Right, so the person was calling and begging the question, how can you want to seriously reduce harm, reduce recidivism, and everything that you just said? This person has recently been released, and I'm believing, I'm pretty sure it's been within that window between now and 2022. And they didn't have what she was calling out was a treatment facility, right? So she said, and I quote, and this makes your point, when I went into the system, there were more treatment facilities for people dealing with substance use. But when I came home, the number had drastically declined. Where am I to go to get the help? You see what I'm saying? And so that drives home the work that we're still having to do and the neglect that returning citizens are, overly and consistently experiencing. And so
Absolutely.
it hurts. It really does hurt. Now we get to talk about, because we've kind of painted this, framework, this call to action in terms of like the decreasing of the funds, not going towards returning citizens, not making real pathways. The numbers are going up. More people are needing help, and it seems like people aren't taking this seriously, and they're just sitting on their morals. And yet people go, come home every single day and they're just left to their own vices. And that's not how we should be treating. I'm saying this, and I want you to kind of weigh in on it a little bit.
Yeah.
That's not how we should be treating our fellow brothers and sisters who are also members of our neighborhoods and our community, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to kind of talk about understanding the advocacy work that we're up ahead, that's coming up ahead as far as it relates to putting our dollars and our finances here in the District of Columbia to really invest in reentry services and our advocacy around that. So for our listeners, and, as we continue this conversation, let's put into context, right? When we say returning citizen, what do we mean, and what are we talking about in this context as far as fiscal policy?
Mm-hmm.
And can you share an overview of your advocacy efforts, whether it's programming, initiatives, or policies that your organization supports for successful stories of impact and moments in time where you've called out this lack of funding, right? But this is the work that your organization is fighting to actually, highlight, and this is hopefully the outcome that you're trying to drive towards.
For sure. And so, no, I think that's a really good point to make sure to, define what we're talking about when we say returning citizens. So when I say returning citizens, I mean anyone that's been charged, convicted of a criminal offense. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that you serve time, whether that be in jail or prison. But anyone that's, actually been charged or convicted with a criminal related offense. So, the reason that, we look at it from this point of view, because we understand that even if you aren't incarcerated, the consequences of having a criminal record still present a lot of barriers, and it still makes it challenging to get some of the things that we talked about, like employment opportunities and housing. So just having a criminal record, regardless of if you served incarceration, but also for folks that have or are currently incarcerated. So that's what we mean when we say returning citizen. And and our advocacy, as I said, we are a Fiscal Policy Institute, so we primarily focus on reforms through the budget, but also legislative changes. And so I've testified on a number of different occasions, most recently in April and February of 2024 around the need for funding for the Second Chance Amendment Act, but also some policy changes that I believe still should be implemented. Some of those policy changes are around speeding up the process for actually getting record relief. So currently, we have really long waiting periods that's listed in the Second Chance Amendment Act. There are 5-year waiting periods. There are waiting periods that can be up to 10 years, depending on your offense. And so those waiting periods, we know during that time, returning citizens still will be facing barriers to employment, a lot of the barriers that we mentioned. And so one critical aspect for us is to try to continue to advocate and make the case to the council that we need to shorten those waiting periods, and even to shorten them to start at the time of someone's conviction. Because right now, in the language of the Second Chance bill that's passed, waiting periods won't start until someone has been released. And so what that means is, if you serve a certain amount of time while you're incarcerated, that doesn't necessarily start your sentence completion. Your sentence completion is after you have completed your terms for supervision or parole, probation. So we know that oftentimes that goes well beyond when someone is actually physically released from a correctional institution. And so during that time, people are still being blocked from a lot of these employment and housing and other opportunities. So that's one way we want to continue to strengthen that legislation. But we've also released a number of public-facing reports and research. A critical part of our organization is also really trying to provide research and data, particularly to the DC Council, to influence their funding and their policies that they pass.
I just want to jump in because we've got to get to that part of it, Michael. We got to, because that's critical. But in all that you said, right, as around what we're talking about now in our conversation about how the DC Fiscal Policy Institute define the returning citizen from you all's lens, right, from you all's approach, and all that you guys have been doing since you said April of last year to push for redefining this narrative of waiting periods, right? Mm-hmm. And I could not, scream louder about the fact that it seems like the punishment is being compounded, right? Mm. Like it's continuing, and this is not the barrier is really going up as opposed to helping us, when we come home from the legal system, have opportunities, because now they're having to wait even longer, and it seems more punitive. It's just another way. You've paid your debts to society, right? You've made a mistake. You've now been released, and then now upon your condition of release, there's still there's still things that people are willing to say, we're not going to help. Basically, we're not willing to help. And so I hope now what you were about to share, I'm excited to hear about this research and these publications you said that can kind of even further illuminate the work that you guys do from the lens of how you understand returning citizens and how you do your advocacy.
Yeah, no, I'm really I'm really glad you brought that up, because when we talk about when you talked about compounding consequences, this continuous punishment, that's really the crux of what I hope to really make the case about it. And that's really what the crux of my work is really trying to show, is that we are compounding and adding continuous consequences onto folks that are involved in the criminal legal system. And you know, it's one thing just about the time you serve, you know, that in and itself, it should be the punishment. But what we see is that there's all these layers of additional punishments, whether that be from you know, the cost of actual incarceration, and that's one of the bigger pieces that I've worked on and this past year in particular is really trying to show how truly costly it is for folks that are incarcerated and their loved ones to be able to afford to be in a jail or prison. You know, there are costs for phone calls, there are costs for commissary, for mail, and there's costs even if you are on a work release assignment. There's a 20% tax that DC can levy for anyone that is in a work release assignment on all the wages you earn. And so when we talk about compounding consequences, that's one of the ways. Is first, you know, through you know, actual incarceration, but then these all these compounding costs, and then when you look at the, you know, once folks actually return and are released, there's not enough supports for people, and so there's this continuous, like you said, cycle where we are, you know, continuously punishing people well beyond the time that they serve, and then once they're released, again, not providing enough services, and blocking people from opportunities like employment and housing, and so all this is connected, and goes with each other.
Yeah, I want to, because I do want to hear what you're about to say about the public facing research as it relates to this advocacy work at your organization and from your lens. But I just heard what you said, and it made me think, right, Michael, that I just can't run past what you said, because it just seems like the system, why are we investing in prisons and not people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And after what you just shared about the tax and the fees that are associated with adding layer upon layer of burdens on citizens here in DC, it just seems so unfair. It just seems like there is a reverse way of pulling the money out of those who have are vulnerable, you know, who are now in a condition where they're, you know, I guess I want to say, you know, this they're under the state, you know, rule,
Mm-hmm.
and here the state is continuously finding ways to build barriers and profit off of this.
Yeah.
And so I want our listeners to understand what you highlighted is exactly the fiscal things that should be happening, you know, calling out what we can do to change it, but what you just shared as far as the things that are literally happening and taxing returning citizens and justice impacted individuals in a way while they're going through the legal system, it shouldn't be so. And so I just wanted to make sure that we didn't rush through that, because it's such a critical thing to the work that you're doing. What were you going to say about the public facing research?
Just that, you know, again, we have been releasing and we'll continue to, you know, release, you know, research that really highlights and focuses on the supports and you know, the importance of continuing to you know, invest more in returning citizens. And one of the reports that I mentioned around those costs is really been you know, one of our bigger pieces, and you know, it's all about basically what you just said around exploitation, and that's really what it is exploiting folks who are already vulnerable, and you know, the way that we have continued to push the costs of these criminal legal systems onto people and families is really is a shame, and you know, we didn't need to be thinking more about ways to really invest more in the people instead of you know, continuously extracting from them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think some of the things that you mentioned as far as like ways in which, you know, we need to be eliminating the high cost, like you said, of incarcerating of people and their families who have to deal with the phone and communication fees, right? Or the work release fees, or you talked about commissary. I'm sure there's kind of medical copays and other fees in federal institutions that burden, you know, inmates. But I feel that these policies that we as a community can kind of, you know, look at the numbers, look at the public facing research that you're talking about, the publications, and really grasp what is going on the inside. Because I do now, I'm thinking about what you just said. There is a preconceived concept, right, that we are investing in people and not prisons. Like we hear terms like we're rehabilitating and we're providing supports and services to help our brothers and sisters with reentry programming inside and outside, so that we're connecting those dots. But after all that you've shared so far, it just really shows a different picture, and it kind of dispels what people might believe is more of a myth, right? Like it's not. It's like these are things that gatekeepers and political pundits use as a way to push a narrative about a system that is failing their own citizens.
And that's such a good point, because when you talk about rehabilitation, I would say, you know, how can we say, you know, we're rehabilitating folks if we aren't treating people with humanity? You know, that's the real issue is we really are not treating people, particularly people who are incarcerated, as with humanity. And we think about particularly the wages that folks earn while they're incarcerated. People, if they earn money at all for their labor, and in many states they don't, they're earning $2 to $3 a day. And again, thinking about the costs associated with court fines, the fees that I mentioned earlier, all these are ways to really strip the humanity from people, and so we can't really talk about rehabilitation if we aren't treating people as humans first. And so that's a critical need, and those policies that you mentioned definitely, I think, could be a start. But we need to really invest our resources more and more into these communities.
I couldn't agree with you more as far as, you know, the work that you are currently working on with the Second Chance Amendment Act, and then this whole drive and initiative around, you know, we need greater investment in reentry services to fully meet the needs of returning citizens, right? And so just to, you know, as we continue to dive into this conversation around understanding advocacy and the work that you're doing, we know that we can't talk about that without really clearly defining what the challenge is. And I would love to hear from your perspective, most returning citizens are facing, you know, more frequently than not.
Yeah. And, you know, I definitely can't speak to, you know, all the challenges, and, you know, I think it's definitely something that is very personalized too. And so, but I think, you know, by and large, there's a few different challenges, and I think one of them is housing and financial insecurity. A lot of times folks don't have a stable place to stay after they're released. or family or loved ones that they can call, and unfortunately not enough supports in terms of housing provided through DC to be able to have a place to call home. So housing is definitely a huge challenge, but I would also say, social stigma, and there's this a lot of narratives, a lot of you know preconceived notions about folks that do have a criminal legal involvement. And so there is a lot of, social stigma, a lot of discrimination that folks experience as they return home. And, honestly, you can't also divorce that. You can't separate that from the racism that is still very present today. And we know that particularly 90% of folks in DC who are returning home from incarceration are Black. And so it is a very racialized issue as well. But also, there's a lot of challenges with having mental health supports, like you mentioned. Over 30% of returning citizens reported having a mental health need, but in federal prisons, about only 3% of incarcerated people actually receive regular mental health treatment. So there is a sheer disparity in the need for mental health services and what's actually being provided. And then, just one of the other challenges too is just coming back to a place, especially if you have served a longer sentence that's oftentimes just unfamiliar to you. A lot of times, especially, things have really changed in folks' communities. And so when we talk about reintegrating back into society, a lot of times it looks a lot different from how they remember it. They might not know many of the people, or many of the people might have moved on that they've been in community with before their incarceration. So oftentimes it's just disorienting sometimes as well. So there are many other challenges too, but I think some of those are some of the more common ones.
Absolutely, and it's such a poignant point for the mere fact that because you just defined what the challenges are for returning citizens so eloquently the way you did, it helps us understand the fiscal part of why either recidivism is going up because there is no funding, right? Why harm continues because there's no funding. And we are out here, like yourself, hopefully learning from, podcasts that talk about this this narrative around returning citizens are faced with a myriad of challenges, but where does the actual rubber meets the road when it comes to investing in that financially, right? And so I'm so glad that as we, continue our conversation and understanding advocacy from a fiscal perspective, the challenges aren't going to solve themselves. It's going to take finances. It's going to take funding. It's going to take, like you said, city council putting in policies, whether it's the Second Chance Amendment Act, that will alleviate these barriers, right? And free up a returning citizen from the Olympics, the cycle, the hamster wheel of not being able to get any type of employment, housing, like you said, mental health services that will help them overcome those challenges. We're going to continue talking, Michael. We're going to talk about, what systemic barriers, and we are getting at it now, do returning citizens encounter as it relates to employment, housing, and education, and social stigma, like you just said? How do we address these barriers in advocacy?
Yeah. So I'll touch on first employment. That's one of the, I think, bigger systemic barriers facing returning citizens. And DC in 2014 passed the ban the box law, which basically prevents an employer from inquiring or asking about someone's criminal history before they make a offer of employment. But I will say that is only applies to a conditional offer of employment. So an employer can offer a conditional offer of employment, but then go back and look into someone's criminal history. And if they find they have a criminal record, they can then legally withdraw that conditional offer of employment. And so that is one of the big barriers, I think, in terms of employment. And I'll also say, when it comes to employment, one of the other barriers too is there's also, in DC, a lot of jobs that just will prevent anyone that has a criminal record